Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're here, you're definitely looking for that shortest route to being truly well-informed. And today we are tackling a really complex and frankly pretty vital stack of sources.
Absolutely.
We're diving deep into what seems like a remarkable, maybe even troubling convergence of modern trends.
Yeah.
Think the measurable decline of our collective cognitive abilities.
Yep.
The psychological biases that sort of influence all of us, and how these factors, well, they make us susceptible to some sophisticated and actually strikingly similar tactics used in modern political extremism and indoctrination.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is, laser focused. We're going to unpack a pretty diverse set of sources, everything from studies, by the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, on cognitive decline, to deep psychological analysis looking at things like the Dunning-Kruger syndrome. And then finally, some detailed security analyses comparing the actual mechanisms, the how, behind radicalization across really different ideological spectrums.
So it's about spotting the patterns.
It's all about spotting the universal patterns, how these extreme viewpoints get formed, how they're sustained, regardless of the specific dogma they're actually preaching.
Okay, interesting. Let's unpack this then. Maybe starting not with ideology itself, but with the sort of fundamental architecture of the mind, the cognitive backdrop for everything else.
Yeah,
let's start there. We begin with a piece of data that I think is genuinely surprising to many people. These recent reports, including ones the NIH looked at, highlight this phenomenon, the negative Flynn effect.
That's the one. For most of the 20th century, IQ scores were actually going up. That was the original Flynn effect.
Right, I remember that.
But yeah, our sources are confirming that for the past, several decades now, standardized IQ scores have been steadily going down, declining.
And it's not just a small dip, is it? The numbers are quite stark.
No, it's really not subtle. It's a significant cumulative drop. The key statistic popping up in the source material, looking across several generations, is an estimated decline of about, get this, 14 points.
14.
Yeah, 14 points when you adjust for modern cohort standards. And that's, statistically alarming. It suggests there might be some kind of systemic issue affecting pretty critical cognitive abilities.
And crucially, this decline isn't just across the board, like everything is dropping equally. The research cited here gets specific about which skills are suffering most.
That's exactly where the detail really matters. The sources seem to indicate that the decline is mostly concentrated in what psychologists call fluid intelligence.
Fluid intelligence, remind us.
That's your ability to think logically, solve new problems, in novel situations, independent of stuff you've already learned, the kind of thinking on your feet. And the specific subtests that are driving this score drop often measure things like spatial reasoning, verbal analogies, working memory capacity, that kind of thing.
Right. So not just facts.
Yeah, exactly. While crystallized intelligence, that's the knowledge and skills you pick up over a lifetime that seems to have remained relatively stable, or maybe declined less drastically. But the capacity for complex, abstract problem solving, that seems to be where the erosion is happening.
To really feel the weight of a 14-point drop in this specific benchmark, we probably need to remember where IQ testing even came from. It wasn't always this definitive label.
Oh, absolutely not. You have to think back to, 1905? Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, they developed the first practical intelligence test.
In France?
In Paris, yeah. And it wasn't designed to pigeonhole people forever. It was actually a pretty benevolent tool. Its goal was simply to identify kids in Paris who needed extra help in school. It was diagnostic, fundamentally.
But then it really took off in the U.S.
It evolved dramatically. Louis Terman over here adapted Binet's test in 1916. He's the one who popularized the term intelligence quotient, or IQ, and his work led to it being used everywhere, institutions, even military placement during World War I.
So that really cemented IQ as the measure, the quantifiable thing for intelligence in the public mind.
It did. And this whole paradigm, which was based heavily on this idea of G, or general intelligence.
That's Charles Spearman's idea.
Yeah, Spearman. The idea that there's this single factor underpinning all cognitive tasks. Well, that established view started facing serious pushback, even as early as the 1980s.
With Howard Gardner.
Exactly. Howard Gardner fundamentally challenged that single score model. He came up with his theory of multiple intelligences, arguing, for specialized domains, linguistic, musical, bodily, kinesthetic intelligence, and so on, not just one number.
And then there's Robert Sternberg, too, whose theory seems really relevant to this decline we're seeing, his triadic theory.
Very relevant. The source material definitely emphasizes Sternberg. He argued that real intelligence isn't just one thing. It needs analytical, creative, and practical components.
Okay, so analytical, creative, practical. How does that connect to the decline?
Well, precisely. Here's the paradox the sources seem to present. If the decline is mostly in that fluid intelligence, the abstract, novel, problem-solving bit, it might indicate that our current environment, our society, is maybe neglecting the development of those specific skills.
Bill Sternberg thought were vital for practical success.
Exactly. So the decline might not mean people are fundamentally less capable overall, but maybe that our societal focus, our education, our technology use has shifted away from nurturing those really demanding cognitive muscles.
So what is the environment doing then? If intelligence isn't just fixed genetics, what are the big environmental factors the researchers are pointing to for this cognitive atrophy?
Yeah, the consensus among researchers really points towards sweeping societal changes. The most commonly cited culprits, significant shifts in the education system are definitely mentioned.
How so?
Well, maybe moving away from things like rote memorization, maybe towards more generalist approaches or different kinds of standardized testing structures. Also, shifts in parenting styles get mentioned, perhaps prioritizing comfort over, say, intellectual friction or challenge. But the really heavy hitter seems to be technology.
Okay, let's zoom in on that tech angle.
Hmm.
How does all this increased screen time, this reliance on devices, how does that specifically undermine fluid intelligence, the problem-solving kind?
The sources suggest it's kind of a two-pronged mechanism. First, think about chronic exposure to rapid-fire, low-context content. Social media feeds, quick videos.
Doom scrolling.
Right. It trains the brain for constant context switching and really superficial processing. And that fundamentally seems to erode your attention span and the ability to sustain deep focus.
Which you need for complex problems.
Absolutely. Complex problem solving needs sustained sequential thought. And when we just, outsource calculation or memory retrieval to our phones, we actually stop building those internal computational pathways in our brains.
It really is like using a calculator for every single math problem. The muscle just never develops.
That's a perfect analogy. And the second mechanism involves just the nature of passive entertainment. If there's decreased participation in really intellectually stimulating activities, reading long-form books, engaging in complex strategy games, or having prolonged, demanding conversations.
Things that take effort.
Things that take real cognitive effort. It means the brain is simply less frequently exposed to the challenging tasks it needs to maintain that fluid intelligence. So the implications are potentially huge. It raises alarms about overall cognitive health.
And if we look beyond the individual at the negative implications for society, what does this sustained decline in fluid intelligence mean for our future ability to solve big problems?
Well, the sources raise some pretty serious concerns. A decline in collective fluid intelligence could inevitably impact things like national productivity, innovation, our ability to navigate the really complex challenges we're facing in the 21st century.
Like climate change, economic instability.
Exactly, things that require sophisticated long-term thinking. Furthermore, if you have growing socioeconomic disparities, maybe preventing certain groups from accessing intellectually stimulating environments, well, you risk deepening those social divides.
Creating systemic problems in just our ability to find common ground, make rational decisions together.
Precisely. The challenge becomes fostering those social cognitive abilities, the skills you need for reasoned discussion, complex group decision-making, especially when the individual foundation for those skills seems to be weakening.
And that potential erosion of social cognitive ability, the very skills needed for nuanced critical reflection. Wow, that creates a perfect storm for the next thing we need to talk about. This psychological bias that just thrives on overconfidence and limited self-awareness.
Right. So if the cognitive backdrop is one of potential atrophy and critical thinking, well, the stage is really set for cognitive biases to grab hold powerfully. And we're talking here about the Dunning-Kruger syndrome.
Named after the psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger.
That's them.
Our audience has probably heard the basic idea. The less competent you are, the more you overestimate your abilities. But let's focus on the mechanics that the sources stress. It's not just ignorance, is it? It's described as a dual burden. What does that mean?
That is the crucial insight. It's not just that individuals with limited knowledge lack the skill or the knowledge itself. It's that they also lack the metacognitive ability.
Metacognitive, meaning thinking about your thinking.
Exactly. The skill of self-assessment. They lack the ability required to recognize their own incompetence. You actually need a certain baseline level of knowledge in a field just to recognize the vastness of what you don't know.
So the less skilled you are,
The more likely you are to suffer from what they call illusory superiority. It leads to this false, but often very firmly held sense of expertise.
Okay, let's use a quick, maybe neutral example to make that mechanism really clear before we jump into the politics. Imagine someone who's read, say, one book on chess theory.
Okay, good example. That person might immediately feel like, okay, I get chess now. I could probably take on a grandmaster. Because their very limited knowledge gives them a few rules of thumb that feel powerful.
Right, like control the center.
Exactly. But they lack the deep foundational tactical understanding, maybe the 20 or 30 levels of strategic depth needed to see where their simple plan will inevitably fall apart. The truly skilled player, paradoxically, is often the one who rates their own abilities a bit lower.
Wow.
Because they're constantly aware of the infinite complexity they still have to master. They know how much they don't know.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Now let's apply this psychological phenomenon to political engagement. Specifically, how the sources use it in a critique of certain social movements. The sources mention critics arguing that comparisons made by some Antifa members equating their struggles today with, say, World War II veterans are a powerful example of this syndrome in action.
Yeah, the critique presented at the source is that this comparison represents a really profound historical misinterpretation. And it's fueled by essentially limited contextual knowledge combined with very high confidence.
So the context difference is key.
Absolutely key. World War II was. I mean, it was an existential global conflict against regimes that were actively engaged in industrialized, systemic genocide, mass atrocities on an unbelievable scale, the complete suppression of freedom across entire continents. The stakes were absolute, geopolitical, survival-driven.
And when you contrast that, the source argues, with many modern debates, which often center on things like free speech, campus protests, political correctness, maybe localized social justice issues.
They just don't equate. They're not on par with the existential threats faced by the Allied forces back in the 1940s. That's the argument.
So the Dunning-Kruger aspect here is the lack of contextual awareness.
That's the key finding presented here, yes. The high confidence, maybe derived from a limited reading of history or current events, leads to what the source sees as a misguided moral equivalence. They might have a basic framework, we're fighting fascism, but lack the sophisticated understanding of historical fascism or the nuances of the current sociopolitical landscape to accurately assess the massive difference in scale and nature of these conflicts.
And that's Dunning-Kruger bias manifesting as political activism, according to this view.
That's the argument being made, yeah.
And this false sense of, I guess, historical superiority or equivalence then directly enables the next really destructive stage, this risk of extreme labeling.
It's the confidence to label. If you genuinely believe you are replicating the fight against 1940s Nazism, well, then any opponent, almost regardless of their actual position on current events, logically must be a fascist or a Nazi in your eyes.
Right, the stakes feel that high to you.
Exactly. And this tendency, which the sources highlight, creates an instant, almost impenetrable echo chamber. Meaningful dialogue becomes impossible because every single disagreement is immediately moralized. It's framed as a battle between pure good and existential evil. And that just dramatically accelerates societal division.
But what about the irony the sources point out? This idea that in fighting perceived fascism, a group can actually start to adopt fascistic methods.
That's the core warning in this analysis. Once you commit to that extreme label that your opponents are fundamentally evil, an existential threat, the sources argue that groups claiming to fight fascism can often end up adopting authoritarian tactics themselves.
Like what?
Things like suppressing dissent within their own ranks, shutting down speech they disagree with, and sometimes employing violence. There's a risk they start mirroring the ideological processes, intolerance, suppression of the very systems they claim to oppose. They justify extreme means because they believe the fight is total.
And of course, the vehicle for this accelerated bias, this rapid polarization, is modern technology.
Oh, absolutely. Social media is like the perfect accelerant for the Dunning-Kruger syndrome. Platforms like, Twitter, Facebook, they're built for rapid emotional dissemination, not for careful verification or nuanced debate.
They reward simplicity.
They encourage the simplistic narrative. They reinforce that false sense of superiority because users often only encounter information and opinions that validate their pre-existing, maybe limited worldview. And this just drives movements very quickly towards radical positions, often based on that initial highly confident but perhaps poorly informed interpretation of reality.
Okay, so if that's the state of the individual mind potentially eroding in critical function, susceptible to these self-flattering biases, What happens when that mind interacts with really powerful institutional messaging? ###3, indoctrination in the educational landscape.
Right, so we shift now from individual bias to the structures that really shape our worldview, specifically educational institutions. And here, our sources present a, frankly, deeply critical argument regarding what they perceive as the left in academia.
Okay, what's the core claim?
Specifically, they claim there's been a decline in critical educational standards, and that this has been replaced, to some extent, by a rise in ideological indoctrination.
And this argument seems to rest on a historical shift in what academia focuses on. What specific ideological changes are cited as, displacing that traditional critical engagement?
The sources really pinpoint the late 20th century. They note the dramatic influence of things like critical theory, postmodernism, and identity politics.
Okay.
Traditionally, they argue the focus of the left might have been on classical social justice, equality, often rooted in more universalist Enlightenment principles. The shift, according to this critique, has been towards deconstruction, towards the critique of traditional power structures.
Which isn't inherently bad.
Not inherently, no. But the argument is that this sometimes prioritizes strict adherence to specific ideological frameworks and identity allegiance over things like objective truth, rigorous logic, or critical engagement with alternative perspectives.
So the mechanism of education maybe shifts from how do you think towards here's what you must think.
That is the core concern being raised, yes. The sources argue that educational institutions, especially in the humanities and social sciences, have become, in some cases, ideologically homogenous, meaning they often cite the overrepresentation of faculty holding specific left-leaning viewpoints. And this, they argue, creates an environment where alternative or dissenting opinions aren't just challenged, which is healthy, but might be actively discouraged, silenced, or even penalized.
And that kind of structural homogeneity would undermine the core purpose of a university, right?
Yeah.
Which is rigorous, open intellectual debate.
That's the argument, that it undermines that core purpose.
So how does this alleged homogeneity show up in the actual curriculum? How does it prioritize ideological conformity, according to this view?
Well, the curricula, according to this critique, increasingly focus on social justice initiatives and very specific critiques of power structures, often viewed through what the source sees as the narrow lens of identity politics. And while these topics are absolutely vital for study, the source claims they are sometimes taught not as theories to be examined critically, but more like established, almost unquestionable truths. And this model, they argue, prioritizes ideological allegiance, checking the right boxes over cultivating genuine analytical skills. And that could diminish a student's capacity to actually engage with conflicting evidence or different viewpoints.
This brings us to a really controversial comparison that the sources introduce. They draw parallels between some of these educational practices and military conditioning, or even brainwashing. That's a very strong claim.
It is an extremely strong claim.
How do the authors of these documents justify making such a severe comparison?
They seem to justify it by focusing on the process of conditioning, not necessarily the specific content. The sources that target what they explicitly term the loony left argue that some educators might be employing techniques that echo those used in, say, military basic training or even cult indoctrination.
Techniques designed to instill what? Quron.
Designed to instill immediate loyalty and a readiness to act against a perceived enemy. Think about military conditioning. It often relies on simplifying complex realities and, crucially, vilifying the opposition to ensure unified, immediate action.
Okay, so what's the analogous technique they see happening in the academic setting?
It centers, according to this critique, on the constant and repetitive vilification of opponents.
How so?
By labeling those who hold dissenting or traditional views, maybe conservatives, capitalists, or even just skeptics of specific identity politics narratives, by labeling them as Nazis, racists, or existential threats. The argument is that this fosters an educational climate where dissent isn't just disagreed with, it's perceived as morally dangerous.
And that process bypasses rational argument.
Entirely, the critique suggests. It appeals directly to emotion, fear, anger, moral outrage.
Wow. That sounds like it would have pretty significant psychological repercussions on the students caught up in that kind of environment.
It absolutely could, according to these sources. They posit that this kind of constant, maybe propagandistic pressure could severely exacerbate feelings of alienation and distress, especially among young people still forming their identities. Well, if you're taught that external groups, maybe even your own family structures, are inherently evil or complicit in systemic oppression, that can create a kind of moral panic. And that, coupled with the constant vilification of disagreement, could cultivate really deep-seated anger and aggression.
The sources even go so far as to try and link this climate to tragic outcomes, like school violence. That is a huge claim.
It is a substantial and, frankly, highly provocative link made in the source material. The argument suggests that an institutional climate where hostility towards specific groups is maybe normalized or even promoted.
Or where instructors might seem to celebrate or trivialize violence against perceived adversaries.
Exactly. That this inadvertently fosters a sense of justified anger and aggression among potentially vulnerable youth. Now, it's not claiming direct causation like A automatically leads to B,
Right.
but the source asserts that the normalization of hostility, combined with an erosion of balanced critical thinking, contributes to a general atmosphere where anger is kind of encouraged as the primary or even only acceptable response to political disagreement.
And this whole perspective culminates in a call for external scrutiny, for parents and taxpayers to challenge the curricula.
Yes, the argument definitely emphasizes holding school boards strictly accountable. The sources call for clear policies ensuring that educational content genuinely promotes critical thinking, which has to mean evaluating multiple viewpoints fairly rather than demanding blind allegiance to any single political or social ideology.
And urging parents to question how kids are being taught to view opposing groups.
Exactly. Specifically to safeguard against what they see as potentially extremist viewpoints that might be disguised as just progressive social thought.
Okay, so if these mechanisms of ideological conditioning are seen as being so effective within Western institutions, it forces us to ask, are these mechanisms universal? Do they top up elsewhere? And this is where it gets, as you said, really interesting. We move to a pretty striking comparative analysis. It looks past the vast philosophical differences between, say, radical leftist ideologies and Islamic extremist ideologies.
Worlds apart in terms of belief systems.
Right. But this analysis focuses entirely on their shared tactics of indoctrination. The process, the source argues, is just terrifyingly consistent.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how two groups, one often rooted in secular, maybe post-Marxist thought, the other in religious fundamentalism, can apparently use almost identical psychological levers to recruit people and keep them loyal.
It suggests radicalization isn't random.
It proves, or at least strongly suggests, that radicalization is a predictable system. There are steps, there are techniques.
Okay, let's break down those techniques. First, the emotional appeals they use. The sources say they target different emotions, but the goal mobilization is the same.
Exactly right. So leftist indoctrination, according to this analysis, often targets emotions like empathy and guilt.
Ow.
It uses social justice narratives that emphasize systemic oppression, historical inequality, to try and make recruits feel personally responsible, maybe complicit in past or present harms. The goal is to mobilize them through a sense of shared emotional responsibility, maybe a desire to atone or fix things.
Okay, empathy and guilt. What about Islamic extremist groups?
They tend to target outrage and the desire for vengeance. They portray their cause as a fight against oppression, too, but specifically oppression allegedly perpetrated by the West against Muslims globally. They frame Western nations as aggressors.
So the goal is to incite rage.
A powerful, self-justifying rage, yeah. And a desire for retribution. Different emotions, same outcome. Mobilization.
The next step, which seems vital for both, is the demonization of opponents. How does that play out?
Well, in leftist contexts described by the source, this often involves the immediate zero-sum labeling of anyone who disagrees as a fascist, racist, or reactionary.
And the purpose of that label?
It serves to instantly discredit any counterargument. And, crucially, it fosters intolerance. Because if your opponent is inherently immoral, why would you even debate them? There's no need.
And Islamic extremism uses the same blueprint.
Exactly the same blueprint, just different labels. Adversaries, whether they're secular governments, maybe other Islamic sects they consider heretical, or just the entire geopolitical West, are portrayed as irredeemably corrupt, immoral, maybe an existential threat to the purity of the faith.
So the shared outcome is critical here.
It's absolutely critical. This demonization successfully creates a clear, unbridgeable us versus them dichotomy. And that mindset is what ultimately justifies extreme action, potentially including violence, against those perceived enemies. Why? Because the enemy has been successfully dehumanized and stripped of any moral standing.
And to really solidify this psychological shift, both types of groups require intense in-group solidarity. How do they manage to isolate their members from mainstream society?
They build powerful ideological enclaves, essentially. Leftist movements, the source notes, often rely heavily on collective action, think rallies, protests, using shared language or symbols on social media to reinforce that collective identity and camaraderie.
Shared struggle builds bonds.
Shared experiences of conflict or confrontation really solidify that in-group feeling, and it naturally starts to isolate members from people who don't participate, who aren't in the know.
And Islamic extremist groups. Same goal, different methods.
Same goal, slightly different methods. They might use religious rituals, communal activities, focusing on shared grievances, often operating in tight-knit local cells, but the outcome is the same: achieving isolation from broader society.
So the purpose is identical.
The purpose stressed in the sources is identical: create a powerful sense of belonging where the group's ideological narrative becomes the sole non-negotiable reality. Once someone is inside that enclave, alternative narratives from the mainstream just can't easily penetrate.
Okay, emotional appeals, demonization, in-group solidarity. Finally, the sources talk about the manipulation of institutions to legitimize their claims.
Yes. For the leftist ideology described, the sources identify academics, certain media outlets, and educational institutions as key vehicles. They argue these are used to promote specific progressive ideologies and identity politics.
And the effect.
By establishing control or at least strong influence within these key cultural institutions, they argue, it legitimizes a narrow set of viewpoints while simultaneously marginalizing or suppressing alternative perspectives.
And the Islamic extremist counterpart.
Is the deliberate targeting and sometimes takeover of mosques, madrasas, religious schools, and other religious educational systems. The goal is to disseminate a very narrow, radical interpretation of Islam, making sure the youth are conditioned into adopting these specific positions from a very early age.
So in both cases, it's about structural control of the narrative.
Exactly. And the common thread, the super spreader for all of this today, remains the digital space.
Social media again.
Social media platforms provide that fertile, instant delivery ground for both types of indoctrination. It enables the rapid radicalization of individuals who might otherwise never have encountered these extreme ideas. And as global polarization seems to increase, the appeal of these kinds of radical, often simplified beliefs, well, it only grows. And that increases the risk of division and potential violence from both ideological extremes.
That structural and psychological comparison is incredibly sobering. Okay, let's take the final step now and look at the shared behavior of two groups that are actively engaged in conflict, particularly here in the West, moving from the psychological process to the physical manifestation of extremism.
Right. This next comparison requires us, as you said, to look past the surface ideological labels, what these groups say they believe, and examine the functional criteria, what constitutes a hate movement, at least according to this source's security analysis.
And we're talking specifically about neo-Nazism and Antifa, groups that claim to be mortal enemies.
Exactly. But the argument is that functionally, in terms of their actions and impact, they share some dangerous operational traits.
Okay, but we have to acknowledge their origins are completely distinct first. Neo-Nazism is clearly a post-World War II phenomenon, right? A collection of groups like the National Socialist Movement, NSM.
Dedicated to resurrecting Nazi ideology, racial superiority, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, white supremacy. That's their core.
Whereas Antifa, or anti-fascist action, actually originated much earlier, back in post-World War I Germany, actively opposing the early rise of the Nazi Party.
Right, and it gained more prominence, particularly in the U.S., much later, when activists mobilized using what they call direct action against perceived rising fascism.
Now, ideologically, they seem like polar opposites, even if both sometimes use the word socialism in their historical roots.
Diametrically opposed in goals. Neo-Nazism seeks racial homogeneity, nationalist superiority based on race. Antifa is typically inspired by Marxist thought focused on class struggle, anti-capitalism, often international socialism, aiming to abolish systemic oppression.
So completely different aims. But the alarming similarities, according to this source, emerge when you look purely at their methods and how they end up being categorized functionally. The most obvious common ground mentioned is their propensity for violence.
It seems to be the primary tool, or at least a major tool, for both groups, according to this analysis. Neo-Nazis have a long, notorious history, organized hate crimes, domestic terrorism, violence against minorities, often drawing clear ideological lines back to groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It's systemic violence justified by racial supremacy.
Okay, that's clear. What about Antifa? Their defining characteristic is often described as direct action. How does the source connect that to violence comparable to neo-Nazism?
The source argues that Antifa's direct action tactics frequently escalate into violence, not just against clear neo-Nazis, but against anyone who opposes their broader political goals or is perceived as facilitating opposition. Incidents like the violence at the 2017 Charlottesville rally are often cited.
Where both sides clashed violently.
Exactly. And the critique is that, regardless of their anti-fascist label, their willingness to employ physical force to suppress dissent, to shut down events, or confront opponents physically actually undermines their own stated mission of fighting fascism, because those become authoritarian tactics in themselves. This leads directly to the critical point the source makes on categorization. Neo-Nazism is, without question, classified as a hate movement. It promotes racial intolerance, violence against minorities, and it's classified that way by major organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC.
Okay, but here's the provocative part. Our source takes the explicit stance of labeling Antifa also clearly as a hate movement. That's a very strong claim. What specific criteria does this analysis use to place them in the same functional category, despite their opposing ideologies?
The analysis seems to prioritize behavior and impact over stated ideology. The source argues that Antifa promotes the superiority of its own ideological framework, maybe Marxism, specific interpretations of gender ideology, and demonstrates widespread intolerance and violence, specifically targeting conservative, traditional, or simply dissenting groups.
What kind of violence?
The specific tactics mentioned are things like destruction of private and public property, arson during protests, and organized physical assaults that have resulted in injuries to law enforcement officers, journalists, and civilians who disagree with them.
So the argument is violence and intolerance deployed systematically to enforce an ideology, regardless of whether that ideology is based on race or political theory, qualifies a group as an extremist hate movement.
Precisely. That seems to be the functional definition used in this source. The critical takeaway presented is that these two groups, despite being apparent enemies, are entangled in a destructive, mutually reinforcing cycle of violence and intolerance.
Two extreme responses.
They represent two overlapping extreme responses to contemporary political and social challenges. They become functionally similar, the argument goes, because both reject reasoned discourse, reject established democratic processes in favor of direct action confrontation and the active suppression of their perceived enemies. In that sense, the source portrays them as two sides of the same violent, intolerant coin.
Understanding this kind of cycle, this functional similarity, despite ideological opposition, really requires expertise in both the history of these conflicts and the practicalities of security and self-defense. Which brings us, appropriately, to wrap up this part of our dive. Let's look briefly at the background of Shawn Armstrong, whose works are foundational to much of this discussion, especially concerning the analysis of extremism, indoctrination tactics, and conflict resolution.
Right. Shawn Armstrong is described in the materials as a pretty multifaceted authority. He's a self-defense instructor, yes, but also a historical analyst, an author, and even a philosophical inquirer. His overall work seems dedicated to personal safety and security.
Which requires understanding threats.
Exactly. It requires a deep understanding of human conflict, why it happens, how groups behave, and how extremism develops.
And his academic background gives him a very specific, almost layered lens for analyzing conflict, doesn't it? It seems to link law enforcement, homeland security, and specific counter-extremism studies.
It really does. He started with an Associate of Applied Science in Criminal Justice from Tompkins Cortland Community College. Okay, practical foundation. But then, crucially, he layered on very specialized knowledge. He got a Bachelor of Arts in Homeland Security through the Naval Postgraduate Program.
Okay, that's significant.
Very, and perhaps most relevant to our discussion today, his scholarly work included a graduate diploma specifically in counterterrorism, with a focus on Islamic Jihad, also from the Naval Postgraduate Program.
So that explains the comparative analysis.
Precisely. That expertise gives him detailed academic knowledge of the structures, the funding, the recruitment, the indoctrination mechanisms used by global radical movements. And that framework allows him to identify those shared tactics, whether they're occurring in the Middle East or, as the source argues, potentially in a Western university setting or activist group. He also has specialized training in military emergency management.
So it makes sense, then, that his publications cover such a range from hands-on tactical skills to this kind of deep ideological analysis.
Absolutely. He's got a book like Tactical Training with Firearms, which is about practical proficiency. But then the book Combating Islamic Jihad is obviously highly relevant here, delving into historical context and contemporary terrorism challenges. That's likely where the framework for spotting those universal indoctrination tactics comes from.
And he also wrote Warrior's Path, The Journey of Modern Karate.
Right, which connects the physical discipline with its philosophical underpinnings, again showing that link between action, thought, and resilience.
And his ongoing work seems focused on translating all that complex security and philosophical insight into practical resilience for people today.
Yeah, it says he's currently developing new training modules aimed at aspiring instructors dedicated to fostering resilience and preparedness globally. So his goal seems to be providing practical countermeasures to the kinds of threats identified in his analyses, essentially teaching individuals how to remain secure, aware, and prepared in a world that seems increasingly characterized by this kind of ideological polarization and potential violence.
Moving beyond the rhetoric.
Exactly. His work seems to try and move beyond just the political rhetoric and focus on those universal human traits or vulnerabilities that might make people susceptible to extremism, but also the strengths that make them resistant to it. Hashtag tag outro. So if we synthesize the key themes we've unpacked today for you, we started with that cognitive foundation, the observation, based on the sources, of a potential decline in standardized fluid intelligence.
Right, that baseline capability.
And we explored how that cognitive backdrop might intersect with these highly effective, often divisive ideological tactics, from the self-flattering biases like Dunning-Kruger that can blind us to our own limitations, to the documented use or alleged use of conditioning techniques in institutional settings, and then finally looking at those shared violent tactics used by opposing extremist groups like neo-Nazis and Antifa. According to the analysis,
There's a pattern.
the sources consistently show a clear pattern: psychological biases, specific organizational methods, communication strategies. They seem to be deliberately employed, whether consciously or not, to create and sustain deep, uncompromising polarization.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of the world? The sources really compel us to look past the surface ideology, past the specific banners, whether it's neo-Nazism or Antifa, or the difference between religious extremism and secular extremism.
Well, we get the how, not just the what.
Exactly. To recognize the underlying operational similarities in how hate, intolerance, and radical conformity are manufactured. It really challenges us to ask not just what people believe, but how did they arrive at that belief? And maybe more importantly, what tactics are they, or the groups they belong to, willing to employ to enforce it?
That consistency in the mechanics of radicalization across different groups,
Yeah.
that's perhaps the most chilling takeaway from this deep dive.
We noted earlier that critical thinking is widely cited as the essential antidote to indoctrination.
It comes up again and again.
Okay, and that leads us right into our final provocative thought for you to chew on after we sign off. If critical thinking is the antidote to indoctrination, and yet measured studies, like the ones we discussed, suggest a decline in overall cognitive performance, particularly in those fluid intelligence areas needed for critical thinking, then what foundational systemic changes, maybe going beyond just tweaking school curriculum, might society need to make? Changes to restore or enhance our collective capacity for reasoned, balanced discourse. And how do we do that effectively enough to counter the incredibly powerful emotional appeals and social media dynamics that seem to feed radicalization across all ideological lines?